Rome called the Celts barbarians. It is one of the most successful insults ever spoken. 2,000 years later, most of us still half believe it. We picture Rome in marble and the Celts in mud. Roads and law on one side, painted men screaming out of a forest on the other. Hold on to that picture, because almost every piece of it is going to come apart. The people Rome called savages had already burned Rome to the ground, and Rome never forgot it. The proudest symbols of Roman power, the things that made a Roman magistrate look like authority itself, were not even Roman inventions. And the so-called barbarians were sitting on wealth the whole Mediterranean wanted, buried in graves so rich that archaeologists are still stunned when they open them. This is not the story of civilization meeting savagery. It is the story of two ancient peoples, grown from the same distant root, who took two different roads out of one old world. One road led to the city, the law, and the written state. The other led to the warband, the sacred king, and the spoken oath. For centuries those roads ran side by side, and then one man, in 8 years of war, forced them to collide. By the end of this, you are going to watch one branch of a family bury the other, and then pick up a pen and write the only version of the story that would survive. The question is not whether Rome was the villain. Rome was not a villain. The question is who actually got buried, and who got to decide what the burial would be called. Let us start with how close these two enemies really were. Throw out the idea that the Romans and the Celts were opposites who met as strangers. They were not opposites. They were something more uncomfortable. They were distant relatives. The Romans spoke Latin. The Celts spoke a family of related tongues, Gaulish among them. Different languages, yes, but both belonged to the same enormous family scholars call Indo-European, a web of peoples that spread across Europe and into Asia over thousands of years. Latin and Gaulish are cousins, the way a Spaniard and a Swede are cousins, distant heirs of one older world, and that older world left fingerprints on both. In the deep background of both cultures you find the same recurring shapes: a father god in the bright sky, sacred kings whose right to rule came from blood and the favor of the gods, warriors who lived and died for honor, oaths that bound men more tightly than any law. You can even hear the echo in the names of the gods. Rome had Jupiter, the sky father, the thunderer. The Gauls had a thunder god the Romans recorded as Taranis, a name that simply means the thunderer. These were not the same god borrowed by one people from another. They were two descendants of one far older idea: the storm in the sky, the force that blesses kings and punishes broken promises. So when a Roman watched a Celtic chief swear an oath before his warriors under an open sky, he was not looking at something alien. He was looking at a distorted reflection of his own deepest past, a version of his own ancestors who had never moved into the city. But reflections can frighten you more than strangers do. And before any Roman ever philosophized about shared roots, the two branches of this family had already met in the worst possible way. They had met on a battlefield, and the Celts had won. Around 390 before Christ, more than 3 centuries before Julius Caesar was born, Rome was still a young city, powerful among its neighbors, proud, but nowhere near the master of the world. To the north lived the Etruscans, the older civilization that had shaped Rome's early kings. And pressing down from beyond the Alps came a people the Romans barely understood: the Gauls. The trouble began, the Roman writers tell us, at an Etruscan city called Clusium. A tribe of Gauls called the Senones, led by a chief the Romans remembered as Brennus, had come south and were threatening the city. Rome sent envoys, supposedly to negotiate. Instead, the envoys joined the fighting against the Gauls, breaking the sacred law that protected ambassadors. Brennus, enraged less by the war than by the insult, turned his army away from Clusium and toward Rome itself. The Romans marched out to meet them at a small river called the Allia, a few miles from the city. What happened there became one of the blackest days in the Roman calendar. The Roman line broke almost at once. The army was not just defeated, it was shattered. Many men drowning as they fled across the river. The road to Rome lay open, and there was almost nothing left to defend it. Most of the population fled. A small band of fighting men, along with the most important priests and treasures, withdrew to the Capitoline Hill, the sacred citadel at the heart of the city, and barricaded themselves in. The Gauls poured into the streets below and burned and looted at will. According to legend, the oldest senators refused to flee, sat in their official chairs in silent dignity, and were cut down where they sat. Then comes the most famous image of all. The Gauls attempted a silent night assault up the steep side of the Capitol. The sentries, and even the dogs, did not notice. but the hill held a flock of geese sacred to the goddess Juno, and the geese heard the attackers and erupted into noise, waking the garrison in time to throw the Gauls back. To this day, when we say a warning came just in time, we are echoing those geese on the capital. The siege fell cleanly to neither side. The Romans, exhausted and starving, agreed to pay the Gauls a ransom in gold to leave. And here Brennus gave history one of its coldest lines. When the Romans complained that the Gauls were using dishonest weights to measure the gold, Brennus is said to have thrown his heavy sword onto the scale and growled, in effect, "Woe to the conquered." The defeated do not get to argue about the terms. A warning that matters for the rest of this story. These accounts were written down centuries later by Roman authors who were as much patriots and storytellers as historians. Much of the detail, the geese, the senators, the exact words of Brennus, is likely legend layered over a real catastrophe. But it does not matter whether every detail is true. It matters that Rome believed it. The sack became a permanent wound in the Roman mind, and for generations Romans carried the memory of the time the Gauls took the city. So when, 300 years later, Romans called the Celts barbarians, that word was not cool, detached contempt. It was fear with a long memory behind it. These were the people who had once taken Rome, and that fear, as much as any ambition, is part of what would eventually march north with Caesar. And there is something the sack quietly reveals. The Gauls did not come from the edge of the known world. They came from just over the mountains, and many never left. By Caesar's time, the whole rich plain of northern Italy, the Po Valley, was so full of Celtic peoples that the Romans called it Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul on this side of the Alps. There were Celts living in Italy itself for centuries. They were not outside Roman history. They were woven all the way through it. That is the first crack in the word barbarian. The second runs deeper, because it goes to what these two peoples actually were. They were not a higher form of life facing a lower one. There were two answers to the same human questions. Let us look at both, starting with Rome's. Rome's answer to the world can be summed up in one idea. Rome made power permanent by turning it into institutions. Rome counted things. This sounds dull, and it is one of the most powerful things any society has ever done. It registered its citizens in the census, recorded who owned what, who owed what, who could vote, who could fight. It built a ladder of public offices that men climbed in a fixed order, each post with defined powers in a fixed term. Power in Rome did not belong to whoever was strongest this year. It belonged to whoever held the office, and the office outlived the man. That is the quiet genius of Rome, and it is easily mistaken for mere brutality. Rome's strength was never that every Roman soldier was braver than every enemy. Plenty of enemies were braver, and Rome lost battles constantly. Its strength was that a general could be killed, and the war would go on, because the war did not belong to him. It belonged to the Republic, which could simply appoint another general and raise another army. Rome could lose, learn, rebuild, and come back next year and the year after, with a patience that wore down enemies who could only win quickly or not at all. Now here's what we get wrong. The other road, the Celtic one, was not the absence of all this. It was a different and very old way of organizing the same human energies, and in its own terms it worked. If Roman power flowed through paperwork, Celtic power flowed through people. The Celtic world was built on a warrior aristocracy. Noble families held land, cattle, and weapons, and around each great man gathered a following of warriors bound to him personally. The bond was not a line in a register. It was an oath, sworn aloud, face to face, and backed by honor, gifts, feasting, and loyalty. A Celtic noble measured his power in the number of armed men who would ride at his word, the cattle in his pastures, the gold on his arms, and the size of his name. And that last item, the name, mattered enormously. In a world without a machinery of written records, memory itself was the archive. A man lived on in the songs told about him. Reputation was not vanity, it was survival. So generosity, courage, the great feast, the keeping of one's word, these were not just personal virtues, they were how power was built and held. This is why it is a mistake to imagine the Celts as poor men hiding in forests. Their society was hierarchical, wealthy at the top, and deeply ordered, just in a different key than Rome's, with its own specialists in law and ritual, its kings and councils of nobles, and a sense of the sacred woven through all of it. Where Rome trusted the institution that outlived the man, the Celtic world trusted the bond between living men and the memory that outlived them in story. Both could produce greatness, but they answered danger very differently, And that difference is the hinge on which the whole tragedy turns. Hold that thought. First, we need to deal with the thing that makes the word barbarian almost laughable. The Celts were not just well organized, they were rich, spectacularly provably rich. And to see how rich, we have to go down into a salt mine and then open a grave. High in the Austrian Alps there is a place called Hallstatt. The name means more or less the place of salt, and it has given its name to an entire era of early Celtic culture, the Hallstatt period, because of what was found there. In the ancient world, salt was not a seasoning you took for granted. Salt was survival. It preserved meat and fish through the winter. A community that controlled salt controlled something everyone needed and few could get, and that meant wealth and power. At Hallstatt, people had mined salt out of the mountain for centuries, and the conditions deep in the mines were so unusual that they preserved astonishing things, including the tools, the clothing, and even the bodies of ancient miners. Then there was iron. The second great age of this culture is named after another site, Tène, and it is associated with iron and with a flowering of stunning Celtic art and metalwork. Iron meant tools, wagons and chariots, and above all weapons. A people who could mine and forge iron at scale could arm themselves and trade their surplus. So when we imagine Celtic elites, we should not imagine paupers. We should imagine men who sat on top of mines, herds, and trade routes, and who displayed their wealth the way wealthy elites always have, with imported luxury and unforgettable objects. And now the grave. In 1953, near the village of Vix in eastern France, archaeologists opened the burial of a Celtic woman who had died around 500 years before Christ, so richly buried that she is often called the Lady of Vix. She wore a stunning golden torque, a neck ring of astonishing craftsmanship, and beside her stood an object that still stops people in their tracks. It is called the Vix krater, a giant bronze vessel for mixing wine. Listen to the numbers. It stands over 5 feet tall, it weighs more than 450 pounds of bronze, and it could hold something on the order of 1,100 liters. It is the largest metal vessel to survive from the entire ancient classical world, and it was buried in the grave of a Celtic aristocrat, in what Rome would later sneer at as barbarian country. Here is the detail that turns the insult inside out. The krater was not made by the Celts. It was Greek work, almost certainly produced in a workshop far to the south, then carried in pieces across mountains and rivers to that grave. And much of the rest of the rich feasting gear buried with these elites was imported too, goods that had passed through Greek and Etruscan hands. That is not the sign of an isolated, primitive people. It is the opposite. It is the sign of a people wealthy enough and connected enough to be plugged into the great luxury trade network of the entire Mediterranean. Celtic elites wanted the best, and the Greek and Etruscan South sold it to them, which raises a question. If the South was shipping its finest work north to these so-called barbarians, where exactly did Rome get its own glittering symbols of power? Here is something Romans themselves never tried to hide. Rome did not invent itself out of nothing. Before Rome ruled central Italy, that region was dominated by the Etruscans, a brilliant and wealthy civilization, in many ways more advanced than early Rome, and Rome's first kings and much of its early culture were shaped by them deeply. Look at the things that made Roman authority visible: the bundle of wooden rods tied around an axe, the fasces, carried before a magistrate as a sign that he held the power to punish and even execute, the ceremonial chair on which high officials sat, the toga edged with purple, the whole solemn theater of the triumph, the great victory parade of a returning general. Even many of Rome's methods of reading the will of the gods, the study of lightning and the flight of birds, a great deal of this came to Rome from the Etruscans. The symbols that made a Roman official look like the very picture of legitimate authority were, in origin, inherited finery from the older civilization Rome had absorbed and eventually overshadowed. And the Etruscans had never lived in a sealed box. Their world reached north and traded with the Celtic peoples of the Alps and the Po Valley. Celtic elites bought southern wares, and in northern Italy, Celtic peoples even adapted writing from the Etruscan alphabet for their own language. These were not 3 sealed worlds, they were 3 corners of one connected web, trading, borrowing, and fighting one another for centuries before Caesar ever drew a sword. So follow the chain. Rome took from the Etruscans the symbols of its own grandeur. The Etruscans had long been entangled with the Celtic world to their north, and then Rome, dressed in the inherited finery of that whole connected web, turned to the Celts and called them barbarians. Now it would be cheap to call Rome a hypocrite. Borrowing is not hypocrisy, it is how every great civilization is built. Rome took in what came before it and made it into something new and formidable. Greece had done the same. The point is that the clean line the word barbarian draws, civilized us over here, savaged them over there, was never real. The peoples on both sides had been shaping each other for ages. The barbarian was always in part a relative in different clothes. And nowhere does that become more uncanny than when Rome's chief priest sat down to describe the holy men of Gaul. Because to do that, one priest had to write about another, and only one of them believed in writing at all. Of all the people in the Celtic world, the ones who fascinate us most, and who we know least securely, are the Druids. And almost everything we think we know about them comes from the very people who feared or conquered them. Strip away the later fantasy, the white-robed wizards of modern imagination, and look at what the ancient writers describe. The Druids were not stage magicians. They were the learned class of Celtic society, and they held enormous power. They were judges who settled disputes, sometimes between whole peoples. They were teachers who trained the young of the elite. They were keepers of religious ritual and sacred lore. In a world that ran on memory and authority rather than written law, the Druids were the law and the memory both. Caesar himself, who met this world face to face, tells us that their training could take many years, that they committed enormous bodies of knowledge to memory, and that they taught a striking doctrine, that the soul does not die, but passes on. He also tells us something that should make us sit up. The Druids deliberately did not commit their teaching to writing. They could write, using Greek letters for everyday business, but their sacred knowledge was kept off the page on purpose, held only in trained human minds, passed from master to student across years of discipline. In a world where writing was available, an entire learned class chose memory over the page, because to them knowledge inside a living mind was sacred and alive, while knowledge dumped onto a page was something anyone could take and cheapen. We should be honest about the darker side too. Greek and Roman writers also accused the Druids of presiding over human sacrifice, including lurid stories of victims burned inside great figures of wood. How much was true, and how much was simply the way one society demonizes another it intends to conquer, we do not know, and that uncertainty is the point. Almost every word we have about the Druids was written by outsiders who wanted to justify ending their world, because here is the collision at the center of everything. The Celtic world guarded its deepest knowledge by refusing to write it down, and the man who would conquer that world and then describe it for all of later history was himself a priest, the chief priest of Rome, and he wrote everything down. Two sacred worlds were about to meet. One kept its soul in memory, the other kept its records in ink, and only one of them would survive the meeting with its story intact. To understand how, we have to meet the man himself. Julius Caesar was not a cartoon villain, and treating him as one makes the whole story dumber than it is. He was something more interesting, a brilliant and dangerous product of his own civilization, doing on a grand scale exactly what that civilization told its great men to do. To understand him, you have to understand a Roman idea called dignitas. It is not quite our word dignity. It meant something closer to a man's standing, his accumulated honor and worth in the eyes of Rome. For an aristocrat of Caesar's class, dignitas was the central currency of life, won through public service, through holding the great offices, and above all through glory. Ambition in this world was not a private vice, it was close to a duty. Caesar was born into an old but no longer powerful patrician family, and he climbed the Roman ladder with extraordinary skill, charm, and nerve, and at extraordinary expense. He borrowed colossal sums to fund his rise, and along the way, in the year 63 before Christ, he became Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state. Hold on to that because it is going to matter. By his 40s, Caesar had reached the top of the ordinary ladder, but he was also deep in debt, surrounded by rivals and hungry for the kind of achievement that would put him beyond all of them. What he needed was a great command, a war, an arena in which to win glory and wealth on a scale that would settle every account and silence every enemy. He got one. He secured command over the Roman provinces bordering Gaul, and just to the north lay a vast, wealthy, and politically divided Celtic world, exactly the kind of world a Roman of genius and ambition could see, with perfect sincerity, both as a threat to be managed and as the opportunity of a lifetime. He did not have to hate the Celts to conquer them. He only had to be a Roman aristocrat of his time, convinced that bringing such a world under Roman order was a worthy and glorious thing to do, and that doing it would make him the greatest man in Rome. In the year 58 before Christ, the chance came. The spark was a migration. A large and warlike Celtic people called the Helvetii, living in what is now Switzerland, decided to abandon their homeland and move west across Gaul in search of new lands. Their route would take them through territory Rome cared about, and past allies Rome wanted to protect. Caesar saw at once a threat to be stopped and an opening to be seized. He moved with the speed that would define his career, blocked them, fought them, and broke their migration, forcing the survivors back toward home. And just like that, a Roman army was operating deep in free Gaul, with a reason to stay. From there, the conquest unfolded over 8 grinding years, and it was not one glorious sweep. It was the patient, brutal application of everything Rome was good at. Caesar fought Celtic peoples and Germanic ones, drove a powerful German leader back across the Rhine, pushed all the way to the ocean, and even crossed the Channel into Britain twice, largely for the prestige of having gone to the edge of the known world and come back. And through all of it, Roman discipline did its quiet, relentless work. The legions built roads and fortified camps every night and could be supplied, reinforced, and rebuilt. When a campaign season ended, the machine did not dissolve, it wintered and resumed. Against this, individual Celtic peoples, however brave, faced an enemy that simply would not go away. But Caesar's greatest weapon in Gaul was not the sword or the camp or the road, it was his eyes. Because Gaul was not one nation, it was a patchwork of many peoples, proud and rivalrous, and Caesar understood that better than they understood it themselves. Each had its own territory, its own nobility, its own ambitions and grudges, and within single peoples, noble factions schemed against one another. Caesar read this map like a master. He did not need to defeat all of Gaul at once, which was impossible. He needed Gaul divided, and Gaul came divided. He befriended one people to crush another. He backed one noble faction against its rivals. He took hostages from noble families to guarantee loyalty. He rewarded those who served Rome, and made terrible examples of those who resisted. Every Celtic strength built on personal loyalty became a lever he could pull, because personal loyalty can be bought, frightened, or turned. And here is the deep tragedy. The Celts were not stupid. They were caught in a system. A world built on personal honor and local loyalty is wonderful at producing fierce, free, proud men, and terrible at producing a unified, disciplined response to an enemy that is patient, centralized, and willing to wait forever. The very things that made the Celtic world admirable were the things Rome used to take it apart. For years it worked, people by people, season by season. But fear and resentment were building. And eventually, almost too late, the Celtic world produced the one thing it had always struggled to produce. It produced a man who could make the proud peoples unite. His name was Vercingetorix. In the year 52 before Christ, while Caesar was occupied with politics back in the Roman world, Gaul rose. At the center of the revolt stood a young noble of the Arverni, a powerful people of central Gaul. He did what no one had managed before. He pulled rival Celtic peoples into a single coalition under a single command, his own, and he understood, at last, how Rome actually had to be fought. He knew he could not simply meet the legions in open battle and win by courage, so he chose a harder, crueler strategy. He would starve them. He adopted a scorched earth policy, burning the food, the supplies, and even the towns the Romans would need, denying Caesar the one thing the Roman machine could not manufacture for itself, the resources of the land it marched through. It was brutal, and it was the right plan. To beat a system that could always come back, you had to attack what fed it. The war that followed was savage. At one great town called Avaricum, the inhabitants begged Vercingetorix to spare it rather than burn it, and he reluctantly agreed to let it be defended. The Romans besieged it, broke in, and slaughtered almost everyone inside, a massacre of many thousands, in a fury of vengeance and hunger. Then at a hill fort called Gergovia, Vercingetorix did something no one had done to Caesar in Gaul. He beat him. Caesar's assault failed bloodily, and he was forced to pull back. For a moment the unthinkable hung in the air. The great conqueror could be defeated, and Gaul, united, might actually be free. But Caesar was never more dangerous than when he was losing. After his victory, Vercingetorix made the one mistake his whole strategy had been designed to avoid. He let himself be drawn into defending a fixed position, a great hill fort called Alesia, where he gathered his army behind the walls and waited for the rest of Gaul to come and crush the Romans from behind. What Caesar did next is one of the most staggering feats in the history of warfare. Rather than storm the fortress or retreat, he chose to besiege it, and to do that he built. His legions threw up a ring of fortifications, ditches, ramparts, towers, and traps, completely encircling the hill fort to seal Vercingetorix in, and then, knowing a massive Gallic relief army was coming, he built a second ring of fortifications facing outward, so that his own army stood protected between two walls, besieging the enemy in front of it and defending against the enemy at its back. Miles of engineering, raised at speed by an army that was itself surrounded and outnumbered. The climax was as terrible as it was decisive. Inside the fortress, the food ran out. In a detail that captures the cruelty of it, the defenders pushed out the women, children, and old people who could not fight, hoping the Romans would let them pass, or at least that there would be fewer mouths to feed. Caesar refused to open his lines. Those people were left to die in the open ground between the walls, in full view of both armies. Then the great Gallic relief force arrived and threw itself against the outer Roman wall, while Vercingetorix attacked from within. For a time the fate of Gaul balanced on those ramparts, and the Roman lines held. The relief army broke and scattered. Inside Alesia, all hope was gone, and Vercingetorix, the one man who had finally united the Celtic peoples, did the only thing left. He surrendered himself to Caesar, to spare what remained of his men. The great coalition, the very thing the Celtic world had always struggled to build, had come at last, and it had come too late. With Alesia, the back of Gallic resistance was broken, and within a couple of years the conquest was effectively complete. The question that should haunt us is, what did it cost? The ancient figures are staggering, and they must be handled with care. Later writers claimed that over the course of the conquest, something like 1 million people were killed, and another 1 million enslaved. But these numbers come largely from sources sympathetic to Caesar, whose own account was itself a brilliant piece of self-promotion, so the figures may well be inflated. And yet, even if we cut them down hard, what remains is enormous. The conquest of Gaul was one of the most destructive events of the entire ancient world. Whole peoples were shattered, vast numbers were sold into slavery and shipped south. Towns were burned, populations uprooted, a whole way of life broken across a single generation. This was not a gentle absorption. It was a conquest, with everything that word honestly means. And yet, to keep the picture true, we have to hold the other side as well. The Roman peace that followed was also real. In the generations after the conquest, Gaul was knit into the Roman world. Roads were built, towns grew, trade flourished under a single law. The descendants of the conquered became, in time, Roman citizens, and a new culture emerged, neither purely Celtic nor purely Roman, a Gallo-Roman world that would become one of the richest parts of the empire. So the ledger does not settle into anything simple. Rome brought catastrophe, and Rome brought a lasting and prosperous order, and both are true at the same time. But there is one part of the cost rarely counted in blood or coin, and it is the strangest loss of all. In conquering Gaul, Rome did not only take its land and its freedom, it took its voice. Remember the Druids and their fierce refusal to write their knowledge down. Remember that an entire learned class chose to keep the soul of their culture inside living human minds, safe from the cheapening page. Now see the terrible price of that choice. When Roman power swept across Gaul, and especially when it later moved against the Druids directly, as a focus of resistance and identity, that whole world of memory had almost no defense against being forgotten. Knowledge held only in trained minds dies when those minds are scattered or killed. The Celtic world had poured its deepest wisdom into the one vessel a conquest could empty completely, human memory, and so most of it is simply gone. We do not have the Druids' teachings. We barely have their words for things. An entire intellectual tradition fell almost silent. And what survived to tell us about them? The words of the man who conquered them. Caesar's account of his wars in Gaul is one of our single most important sources for the Celtic world. His description is much of what later ages would ever know about the Druids, about Gallic society, about who these people even were. The Roman general became, by an accident of survival, one of the main narrators of the people he destroyed. The conqueror wrote the description, and the description outlived the conquered. There is one small, haunting exception. Long after the conquest in Roman Gaul, someone made a calendar of bronze, found in fragments at a place called Caligny. It is Gallo-Roman, made after the conquest, written using the alphabet of the conquerors, and yet it preserves a sophisticated system of Celtic timekeeping, a complex reckoning of months and years that shows the old Gaulish tradition of measuring sacred time did not simply vanish into the word barbarian. It survived, quietly, in bronze, a small stubborn proof that there had been a real intellectual world there, counting the heavens all along. But one bronze calendar, against a whole lost library of memory, is a thin survival. As for Vercingetorix, Caesar kept him alive as a prisoner for years, and then displayed him in chains in the great triumphal parade through Rome that celebrated the conquest, before having him put to death. Even the leader of Free Gaul ended as a figure in a Roman story, a trophy in the conqueror's pageant, his last public role written entirely by Rome. This is the cruelest kind of immortality, to survive only inside the words and the triumphs of the people who ended your world. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. Rome called the Celts barbarians, and the Celts no doubt had their own hard words for Rome. But the longer you look, the more that clean line dissolves. These were never two strangers who met by accident. They were two branches of one ancient family who took two different roads out of the same old world. One road led to the city, to law and the census and the office that outlives the man. The other led to the warband and the sacred king, to the oaths sworn aloud, the salt and the iron, the honor that lived or died in memory, the priest who would not write. Neither road was savage. They were two serious answers to the oldest human questions: how to hold power, how to live well, how to be remembered. And the ironies pile up until they become almost unbearable. The barbarians had burned Rome itself, and Rome never forgot the fear. The proud symbols of Roman authority were inherited finery, passed up from the Etruscans, who had long been entangled with the very Celtic world they looked down on. The barbarians were rich enough that the Mediterranean shipped its finest work into their graves, and then the two roads which had run side by side for centuries finally collided in the hands of one brilliant, ambitious Roman who was himself a priest, who conquered the other world, and then took up a pen and wrote the only full account that would survive. In the end, one road built the empire that got to write the history. The other lived on mostly in the margins, in a few fragments of bronze, in the gold and the great krater pulled from silent graves, in place names and scattered words, and the long memory of a fear. Rome did not meet a savage. Rome met a relative whose way of living had become impossible to leave standing beside its own. This was not civilization conquering savagery. It was one ancient brother outliving the other, and then with genuine brilliance and without a trace of mercy, telling the story for them both. And every time we repeat the word barbarian without thinking, we are still 2,000 years later, reading from the version the winner wrote.